We don't have room for such old junk. You can pack up and leave this booth." The voice of the organizer rang out, cold and definitive amid the raucous fair music. Arthur Bennett, 76 years old, merely bowed his head slightly. His hands trembled as he clutched the wooden ship model he had spent 2 months crafting with his own hands. He made no protest, not a single resentful glance. He simply turned his back and walked away from the booth, like a solitary sail drifting away from its dock. No one in the crowd knew that the ship model was a scaled-down version of a 1974 rescue vessel, a vessel that had saved 25 people in the midst of a storm under Arthur's command. Nor did they know that just 1 hour later, the harbor of the town would reverberate as a fleet of Navy ships arrived, led by Arthur's own son, now a destroyer commander, bearing a thunderous commendation. Why would a father, dismissed from a fair booth, prompt the entire Navy to intervene? Hit subscribe on Veteran Best Stories to follow the moving tale behind this seemingly anonymous ship model. Under the pale sunlight of an early spring morning, the sea wind fair began to awaken like a familiar melody, played for the 30th consecutive year. The bay breeze whispered through the canvas tents, carrying the scent of freshly baked waffles, sea salt, and the sounds of children laughing at the game booths. Yet amid that lively cacophony, a small corner remained wrapped in silence, an overlooked spot where an old man meticulously wiped each grain of sand from his tiny wooden ship model. Arthur Bennett had been seated there since before the sun fully rose over the water. His folding chair creaked with age, and his little wooden table was similarly weathered. On the tabletop, 4 ship models stood in a straight line, each mooring rope and steering wheel honed by the hands that once gripped a real ship's wheel out at sea. To most, they were mere crafts. To Arthur, they were wordless records of raging storms, roaring nights at sea, and the souls he had steered through those dangers, souls not all of whom had returned alive. He wore a fraying plaid shirt and a sand-colored canvas cap, the same cap he'd kept since leaving the Navy. His face was sun-baked and lined, but his eyes held a peculiar clarity, the gaze of a man who had once stared death in the face without faltering. This year, he proudly displayed his masterpiece, the model Guardian 74. Not just any craft, it replicated with every bolt and beam the rescue vessel that had plowed into a 1974 typhoon. On that pitch-black night, with radar and radio dead, Arthur and 4 crewmates had pulled 25 people from the Pacific's fury. Though no medals had been issued, in Arthur's heart, that vessel stood for something far greater than recognition: unconditional courage. Yet Seawind today was not the Seawind he once knew. The fair no longer invited folk to pause and listen to stories or admire handcrafted beauty. Glittering tech booths with virtual reality headsets, gaming rigs, and vivid photo prints sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Children tugged parents toward digital amusements. Adults queued for selfies in front of faux ocean backdrops or starry skies. Arthur's humble booth lay silent, a discordant note in a symphony of blinking screens. An hour after opening, as he carefully wiped the Guardian 74 model for the second time to remove drifts of salt, a young man in a black polo, emblazoned with the fair logo, stepped forward. Without glancing at the models, he spoke in a low but steel-cold tone. The booth failed to meet this year's visual experience criteria and lacked sufficient appeal. Such carefully chosen words could not mask the truth. An old man and a few wooden ships no longer belonged in a world fueled by LEDs and curved screens. Arthur asked no questions. He offered no retort. He simply lifted his gaze, eyes dimming, and then inclined his head in silent thanks, a reflex born of years in uniform. His trembling hands gathered the models, as if stroking memories. When he hugged the Guardian 74 close, a flicker of confusion passed across his face. Not shame, but uncertainty as to where it belonged in a world that no longer listened. He left the booth like a lone sail drifting from shore. No splash, no wake. At his feet, shells crunched underfoot. Behind him, laughter still echoed from the Fleet of the Future simulation, where children cheered as they shot virtual ships with laser guns. And Arthur, who once actually steered a vessel through a storm to save lives, was driven from the shore merely for being low on interactivity. Settling onto a bench by the harbor, he placed the model in his lap, his fingers tracing its hull like a gentle caress of memory. The midday sun danced across the water's surface, the waves reluctant to erase something that quietly endured. In his heart, there was no anger, only a vague sorrow, like a tide slipping away unnoticed. Time is always like that. It never warns when someone becomes unnecessary. Yet even then, in Arthur's gaze there flickered something unextinguished, a tiny spark of belief that if he had once been trusted amid a great storm, perhaps there remained someone, just one, who still remembered the wooden ships and the man who had devoted his life to crafting them from wind, water, and sincerity. Arthur found a seat a few hundred meters from the fair, a solitary stone bench near the tip of the harbor, where gentle waves lapped against the old wooden pier, and the water reflected a sky freckled with clouds. The sea breeze drifted through the mangroves, carrying the briny scent of salt. It seeped into his shirt and settled in the creases at the corners of his eyes. He placed the model of the Guardian 74 on the bench beside him, yet his hands did not fully let go. They hovered around the hull, as if fearing that if he released his grip, the boat, or something within him, would vanish on the wind. His palms were calloused and cracked, each finger trembling with each breath. The thick, darkened skin of age bore scars from long ago. Each mark told a story, a pitch-black night, a sudden gust, a life rescued. But now, what once symbolized strength and experience lay forgotten on hands that no one needed. He sat there, silent, shoulders slumped forward, eyes fixed on the sunlight-dappled water. Every glint of light seemed to carry a piece of memory. It flickered briefly, then disappeared, never to be held. There was no anger in him, nor was there shame. What he felt, smoldering and aching, was a silent emptiness, one without a specific name, but filling every breath. A hollow ache born not of the fair's brief rejection, but of the way the world quietly turned its back, casting aside what once mattered. He had once stood before nautical charts, pointing toward the North Star, teaching young recruits to listen to the sea with intuition and hard-won instinct. Now, he was sidelined by a virtual reality attraction, told to leave as though he were an irrelevant relic in a scene that no longer fit. He recalled the eyes of one pupil, hands trembling in his first storm, strength enough to haul lines but lacking belief. Arthur had stood just behind him, hand over hand, steadying and guiding, much as he now cradled the model ship, as though holding on to a time when he had been the anchor for others amid raging seas. Yet the world no longer had a place for that steady hand. "Useless old man," someone had said. Though he did not react, those words did not drift away like a breeze. They etched themselves into the deepest part of him, where he had believed himself immune to hurt. And then, as he sat there, alone beneath the vast sky, Something happened without his knowledge. A few nautical miles out, the destroyer USS Hamilton altered course. Its engines hummed low, like the stirring of a soul waking after years of silence. In the control room, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Bennett held the radio handset tightly, eyes fixed on the radar screen. A brief message came less than an hour ago. It had prompted him to abandon his training schedule, assemble his crew, and persuade the Security Council that this action was necessary. In his heart, there was no room for hesitation. Andrew grew up to the sound of waves and the scent of ship timber. His father never spoke of war, yet taught by example, by rising after every setback, by eyes forever fixed on the horizon even after storms had passed decades ago. As a teenager, Andrew was once made to sit for an entire afternoon drawing navigation charts, simply because he'd misplaced a single line on the map. When he joined the Navy, his father merely nodded, no words of luck. Yet that night, Andrew discovered his father's old wooden compass quietly tucked into his uniform pocket. It was the only thing he sent with him, and the most important lesson of all. So when Andrew received a message from an old friend, now a freelance reporter at Seawind, with a blurry photo, Arthur sitting alone, clutching his model boat, being ejected from his own booth in the fair, Andrew's heart clenched, not because his father had been rejected, but because he had accepted it in silence. That should never have happened. Not to the man who once steered through the fiercest gales, who had supported an entire generation of young sailors, who lived without need for applause. He didn't hesitate. The order was given. The ship turned its bow toward the town. There would be no advance notice, no orchestrated ceremony. Yet he understood. There are honors that cannot wait to be printed on invitations. There are actions that must be taken before it's too late. On the deck, he donned his uniform with the same resolute gaze his father had once taught him to hold steady at the helm. And deep in his heart, he knew, today, he was not merely a commanding officer, he was a son. And that father, still sitting alone by the pier, needed to see, one last time, that he had never been invisible. The ship's horn sounded across the fairgrounds like a sharp cut through all existing noise. It wasn't an ordinary signal horn, but one carrying an invisible pull that made every gaze halt, every movement grow sluggish, every laugh fall into a strange silence. The people standing in line for food, the children playing on plastic whale rides, the teenagers taking selfies in front of the paper flower arch, all turned toward the shoreline, where the horizon was gradually revealing the silhouettes of great vessels. Against the pale blue sky, flecked with golden sunlight, a squadron of Navy ships began to emerge, steady and solemn, as if the ocean itself had lifted them from its depths. The bow of the lead ship cleaved the waves, creating rolling lines of foam that reflected the dazzling light, causing some to shield their eyes. The American flag flew proudly atop each mast, no special effects or grand stage necessary. That image alone made many hearts tighten, because it carried something larger than any spoken explanation could convey. Arthur remained seated on the stone bench. His eyes, faded by time, suddenly widened. He gazed at the fleet as though he'd wandered into an old dream where reality and illusion merged without boundaries. The sea breeze whipped the faded collar of his shirt, but he paid it no mind. His hand, still resting on the model of the Guardian 74, clenched reflexively. He did not know why these ships had arrived or who had orchestrated this, but deep within him, a faint premonition took shape, that what was about to happen was far from a random visit. The destroyer USS Hamilton led the formation, gliding quietly into port. As its bow touched the docking area, The sound of footsteps echoed across its deck. Dozens of sailors in crisp white uniforms stood at attention, eyes fixed straight ahead, hands clasped behind their backs. None spoke. They simply stood, as living statues, to convey solemn respect for what was about to be revealed. That silence carried more weight than the fairground music, more than any applause that might accompany a medal ceremony. Then, from within that line, a man stepped forward. Lieutenant Commander Andrew Bennett, a tall figure with a calm countenance and shoulders squared by duty, walked with slow, resolute steps. In his hands he held not a medal or a dossier, but the model of the Guardian 74, the very model that, an hour earlier, had trembled in his elderly father's hands. Now it was lifted by the sure grasp of the son his father had once guided through those first days at sea. Arthur rose to his feet as the familiar figure approached. He said nothing. His eyes narrowed, not from the glare of the sun, but from emotion. Words seemed to lodge in his throat. All he felt was his heart pounding and his grip loosening, allowing Andrew to bow and return the model that had fallen from the bench. That simple act, wordless, became the center of attention for the entire fair. Andrew turned to face the crowd. His voice was neither harsh nor defensive, but warm and unwavering as the roots of pride itself. "I am the commanding officer of this ship," he said, sweeping his gaze across their astonished faces, who could not understand why a high-ranking officer would pause in a small town to speak of. An old man and a wooden model. He went on, without hesitation, without glancing at notes. "And this man, standing beside me, is not someone you can easily forget. He taught me and hundreds of other Navy officers the most important skills, not only how to navigate at sea, but how to hold steady when everything around you falls into chaos. He taught us not from books, but through lived experience, with hands trembling after every storm, and with an unshakable gaze in our darkest hours." A hush rippled through the crowd. Those who had wondered why a whole fleet had come here now looked at Arthur, not as a frail old man with silver hair and distant eyes, but as the one who had stood firm amid stormy seas, guiding hundreds toward safety. Andrew continued, his tone steady. "The model I hold in my hands is not a toy," he said, lifting it so the sunlight caught its intricate lines, causing it to gleam like living proof. "This is a replica of the ship that rescued 25 people during the storm of 1974, and the man who built this model was the one who once guided the real ship." Silence enveloped the harbor. No carnival speakers blared, no electronic games whirred. Even the waves seemed to pause, as though making space for the moment. The sea breeze still blew, but now it carried the weight of something mended, a belated justice that was no less complete. Arthur spoke no words. He did not need to. Everything unfolding before him felt like a reversal of tides, sweeping away the silent years he thought would remain buried. He stood there, gazing at the model in his son's hands, and in that instant, he knew he was no longer left behind. Right at the harbor, beneath a cloudless blue sky, a simple wooden platform was erected quickly yet sturdily. It was not a grand stage, nor did it boast decorative backdrops or elaborate lighting. It consisted merely of a few firmly nailed planks, a modest flagpole, and just enough space for one person to stand and speak. Yet this very simplicity made the moment extraordinary. The atmosphere shifted, from astonishment to silence, and from silence to solemnity. Navy sailors emerged from their ranks, each taking position as if every step had been practiced, not for show, but out of reverence. The American flag was slowly hoisted aloft. The gentle rustle of fabric in the breeze sounded like a silent oath. Sunlight streamed through the fabric, casting the flag's bold shape onto the rough wood beneath, a reminder of the spirit Arthur once lived on deck, of balancing through storms, and of seizing another's hand in moments between life and death. Arthur climbed the platform, not quickly, but with unwavering steadiness. Every eye followed him, not with curiosity, but with silent respect. He neither bowed his head nor waved. He simply walked straight ahead, slightly stooped, but bearing the unmistakable confidence of someone who once navigated by the stars. When he stopped on that rustic stage, Lieutenant Commander Andrew Bennett stepped forward, holding a small box wrapped in deep blue velvet. There was no lengthy speech, no recounting of deeds, only a moment of hush where the eyes of father and son met. Then Andrew opened the box and revealed a replica Navy Medal of Honor, solemnly placing it into Arthur's hands under the watchful gaze of all present. No applause erupted then. No one needed to prompt it, for everyone fell silent, as though compressed by an overwhelming wave of emotion. Arthur received the medal as though he were reclaiming a piece of his own past, not for praise, but so it might rest at last, after years of being forgotten. His hand trembled slightly, yet his eyes shone with rare brightness. Then, in that breathless stillness, a slow smile curved at his lips, not flamboyant or ostentatious, but like a warm glow blossoming amid a cold ocean. That feeling, finally being seen, finally being honored, needed no fanfare, for it went straight to the hearts of those watching. The fair organizers, standing at the fringe of the crowd, initially hesitated, but once the ceremony concluded, they could do nothing but step forward. They lowered their heads, eyes cast aside, and offered the apology that should have been spoken long ago. Yet Arthur bore no bitterness. He neither scolded nor mocked. He simply stood tall, looked each of them in the eye with calm gentleness, and spoke in a voice as soft as sea breeze. "I'm not angry. I only want the sea's stories to continue." Those words were brief, unadorned, but their weight left listeners stripped of excuses, for they were more than forgiveness. They were a reminder. That same afternoon, a decision was made, this time not by a committee, but by those who had turned away. Arthur was invited back to the fair, not as a vendor, but as an official part of the event. A new booth was constructed, not gaudy, not digital, but built from seafaring wood in the shape of a small cabin. Above its entrance, a simple nameplate read, "Bennett's Harbor." This booth no longer merely displayed wooden ship models. It became a place where people paused to ask questions and listen to truths not found in books, not on YouTube, not recreated by VR. The wooden ships became living stories on a still sea, tales of unyielding spirit, silent resilience, and of those vessels whose names were never recorded, but whose voyages saved lives. And as a lasting testament, the U.S. Navy made an unprecedented decision. The Guardian 74 model, once cast aside at the fair, was granted a permanent place in the National Maritime Museum. It was placed in a special glass case, not for its wooden material, nor for its craftsmanship, but because the story behind it embodied the maritime heart, courage that needs no fanfare. Beneath the glass was a brass plaque inscribed, "Heroes do not always need medals. They only need a place to be heard." Arthur was not present when the model was installed. He did not ask to be. For him, the most important moment had already occurred at the harbor that day. when his son reclaimed the ship, when the crowd fell silent to hear truth, and when a gentle smile escaped those lips that had long known only sighs. Because for Arthur, receiving the medal mattered less than ensuring the story of the Guardian 74 and of all the nameless vessels that once braved the seas lived on in people's hearts. And if that required only a humble booth, a quiet museum, or a respectful glance to keep that flame alive, then for Arthur that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at the Sea Wind Fair transformed. It was no longer a place where people sought only the glare of LED lights or the roar of video games. Instead, each step toward the Bennett's Harbor booth seemed to slow, to pause, as if something made hearts flutter before minds even realized why. Under the simple wooden canopy, Arthur sat each day behind his small, varnished table, surrounded by neatly lined models of tiny ships. Each wooden vessel, hand-carved, with its rigging and rudder wheels, bore paint strokes so uneven they seemed alive in their imperfection. They did not glitter or glow, yet a gentle light seemed to emanate from the stillness of every detail, a light of memories preserved by hands that no longer trembled with strength. Children flocked to the booth, curious to examine the miniature rudders, leaning in as though discovering an ocean cradled within a palm. They laughed and pointed and asked innocent questions, but even amid those merry voices, something was stirring that they could not name, a quiet respect. For the old man behind the table, though his hair was white as foam and his shoulders trembled in the sea breeze, made every story about the vast ocean feel close and real. The adults asked little. They lingered behind, watching in silence. Some sat beside Arthur, others simply nodded when his gaze met theirs. But when Arthur began to speak, those who had come merely to take a quick look soon forgot their watches, forgot their phones, forgot time itself. He did not recount feats of valor, no lists of victories, no medals, no grand numbers. He spoke in a husky, deliberate voice, like the rhythm of waves at midnight, of a stormy night when the ship plunged into darkness and no one was certain they would see dawn, of spotting the lighthouse in the storm, not merely as a navigational beacon, but as a promise that there was still a place to return, of the splash of water on the hull when the crew, exhausted, clung only to the trust in old charts and the compass Arthur wore around his neck. Those tales needed no drama. The truth, told from the heart, moved listeners deeply. More than once, Arthur paused mid-sentence, his eyes drifting toward the sea, where only blue water and wind remained, as though he were reliving something beyond words, as if someone from his past still walked beside him, never having truly left. The crowd listened in hushed awe. They understood that these words were not just old stories, but living proof of a time when countless souls sacrificed their youth not to be named, but to preserve peace for harbors, for sea lanes, and even for fairs like this one. One late afternoon, as sunlight mellowed into honeyed gold, an 8-year-old girl approached. Her hair was tied askew, her big dark eyes unafraid as she sat down beside Arthur. She said nothing, smiled not at all, but quietly handed him a folded piece of paper. Arthur accepted it, his calloused hands still flecked with wood dust around his fingernails. He unfolded the paper carefully, as if opening an ancient map. On the white surface was a child's scrawl in wax crayon, a pale blue ship against a deeper blue sea, above a sky dotted with fluffy clouds and a grinning sun. Beneath the drawing, in wobbly, childlike handwriting, as if scrawled by waves that had just lapped the shore, came words both innocent and profound. "Thank you for showing the way." Arthur read each letter slowly, his finger tracing the ship's hull in the drawing. For a moment he said nothing. His breath seemed to catch. Then he folded the paper with care, smoothing each crease as though folding a flag, and tucked it into his breast pocket, where he had stored countless sailing orders, in a pocket no one ever reached into for so many years. No one spoke. The girl rose and ran back to her mother, waiting nearby. Arthur remained seated, his chest rising and falling in time with the sea breeze, one hand resting on his pocket as if safeguarding a treasure no one else knew existed. Inside him, something shifted, unnoticed by the world, yet as profound as a tide unseen, carrying an ocean of memories. He understood then that some expressions of gratitude need no grand stage, no applause, no fireworks, only a child's drawing, and just enough space in a breast pocket to keep it safe for the rest of a lifetime. Arthur is no longer young, but since that day, whenever he walks into the fair, people rise to salute him, not because of rank, but because of something far more precious: respect. The Guardian 74 model now rests in a glass case, beside a photograph of him and his son standing together on the ship's deck. One is wood, the other metal, but both share something in common: the heart of the sea. If you believe that a small act, like cradling a ship model, can set in motion a profound change, then this story is for you. Please share it with your loved ones in the United States, so that people like Arthur Bennett are never forgotten. And subscribe to Veteran Best Stories, so you won't miss more inspiring tales where gratitude becomes the wind that rekindles the flame of memory, keeping it alive in our hearts.